everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Time to crack down on protesters breaking the law. That's what the Home Secretary is attempting to do today in a round table with police leaders. Well, will it make any difference at all? We'll explore that question, along with the question of this by-election taking place today, added with the strikes that are grinding the country to a halt. Also, violence against women and girls. Is it getting worse? We're going to explore all of these questions after the headlines.
Tom, thank you. Good morning. It's 9:30. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB Newsroom. The NHS say they've gone live with a new system to help ease the pressures on the health system. More than 40 traffic control centres will help find beds faster for patients. So-called winter war rooms across England will use data to enable staff to divert ambulances away from hospitals at capacity to ones with space available for new patients. UK house prices saw their biggest fall in 2 years in November. Figures from Nationwide Building Society show house prices fell by 1.4% in November, which was the largest month-on-month fall since June 2020. Nationwide says house price growth saw a sharp slowdown, falling to 4.4% from 7.2% in October. Buckingham Palace is facing accusations of being institutionally racist after a royal aide was forced to resign over comments she made at a reception. Ngozi Fulani, who's founder of a domestic abuse charity, says she was repeatedly asked by Lady Susan Hussey where she really came from. The Prince of Wales, who is currently on a 3-day trip to Boston for the Earthshot Prize, has said there's no place for racism in society, and his godmother's comments were unacceptable. Kensington Palace says it was right for her to step aside with immediate effect. British Gas will pay its customers for reducing the amount of electricity they use during peak times to help take pressure off the national grid. The energy supplier hopes 100,000 customers sign up to the scheme, which is run by National Grid. Under it, households will be paid around £4 for every unit of electricity they reduce their consumption by during specific times. St Ives has been crowned Britain's happiest place to live. The Cornish seaside town overtook Hexham in Northumberland to take the top spot in Rightmove's annual survey, which more than 21,000 people took part in. Rightmove say St Ives scored highly for its sense of community spirit and belonging for its residents. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom Harley.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, not content with chairing a meeting of the National Policing Board yesterday, Today, the Home Secretary and indeed Policing Minister Chris Philp are holding a roundtable in Downing Street with police leaders. We're told it will focus on the operational response to criminal guerrilla protest tactics. And we all know what that means. The Prime Minister has reportedly been furious at the inability to deal with small numbers of environmental protesters breaking the law, smashing windows, throwing paint and stopping roads, causing millions in economic damage. So what is the answer here? And can operational changes to how the police engages with these kind of lawbreakers really sort this problem out? Well, Peter Blexley is former Scotland Yard detective and joins me in the studio now. And Peter, it's interesting to look here at the operational side of things. The government has often talked about whether or not stronger laws are needed, but this is about how police respond on the ground. Is it inadequate as things stand?
Oh, most definitely. And we've seen this different tactic this week from Just Stop Oil, where they are walking slowly along the road, thereby obstructing the free passage of traffic. But they're claiming because they're not static, they cannot be arrested. Well, please allow me one moment to read briefly to you from the Highways Act of 1980. And it's a very brief passage, but I would ask you to focus on some of the words that I'll highlight, because I do this because it is my strong contention that the police are misinterpreting the law, thereby not applying it properly, and they should be setting legal precedents, getting courageous lawyers, engaging with the CPS and saying, this is how we're interpreting this short passage, and this is why we are arresting people and charging them. It reads very briefly. If a person, without lawful authority or excuse, well, that's a given, in any way willfully obstructs the free passage along a highway, willfully obstructs the free passage. So that doesn't, for me, say that traffic has to be stopped in its entirety. It's about free passage. And they are willfully obstructing the free passage. We're all familiar with the policing term of a rolling roadblock that they bring in when, say, there's been an accident and they need to move the traffic very slowly. The key word there, block. These protesters are blocking the street, they are willfully obstructing it, and the whole buzzword of significant that the police have got themselves in such a tangle over, well, my legal argument would be they're doing this every day. That in itself is significant.
It's interesting, though, that these cases can clearly be made, but the police seem unwilling to make those cases. The police seem like they don't want to have those arguments. They want to go down almost the least path of the path of least resistance when it comes to dealing with these protesters. Is that an attitudinal thing, or does that come from the top?
I think it's probably both. But in both regards, it's shameful. Look at the public disquiet that is being created by these selfish protests, by these people with this enormous sense of entitlement. And as you rightly alluded to, the Prime Minister himself is reported to be furious about this. So we have the public and we have the Prime Minister, who are both enraged in great, great numbers. There is the law. There is how I have suggested it should and could be interpreted. With the backing of courageous CPS lawyers, let's clear the streets, let the traffic move, let people go about their lives, and let the economy benefit.
This is really interesting because, of course, what we're talking about today, this roundtable with police leaders, the Home Secretary and the Policing Minister, not necessarily about changing any law as things stand, but using the law, perhaps in the way in which you're describing there. Do you have hope that an exercise like the one going on in Downing Street today will listen to cases like yours, will be more courageous in the way they deal with statute as it is written?
Well, sadly, but not surprisingly, I've not been invited to that meeting today. They won't have an oik like me in the room. But here is a very straightforward interpretation of existing law, and if you commit this offence, it is punishable with up to 51 weeks in jail. And that is a recent innovation, so clearly brought in to try and tackle these very sorts of protests. So there it is. It's already on the statute book. All it needs is courageous, innovative application, thinking and prosecution.
Now, what do you say to those who say that there is a right to protest in this country, that just as there is a right to protest in China, as we've been seeing over the last week or so, that should be upheld? Is that an unqualified right?
It's not an unqualified right, and whilst it is, of course, the very cornerstone, or one of the cornerstones, of our flagship democracy, when people organise a large demonstration that will create enormous disruption in central London, there is a liaison with the authorities, in particular the police, and there is a two-way dialogue, and conditions are laid down, routes are planned, people are notified in advance of the disruption that will be caused. And we often see these in considerable numbers taking part at weekends, for example. But this Just Stop Oil guerrilla-type tactic where they leap out of a van, unfurl their banner and cause traffic chaos is not cut from that kind of cloth. And therefore, it is criminal and the police need to act accordingly. They have an absolute disaster at the moment in terms of public trust and confidence. How simply they could win that back.
It is so interesting that these groups of people, it's not just blocking roads. Very often it's going up to buildings and causing criminal damage, whether it's smashing windows or throwing paint over them. And they seem to think that just by saying the word, this is a protest, that absolves them of the criminality that they are actually performing. Why do they have that idea?
There are problems in this itself. Last week, I was talking to a security guard who was stood at the front of one of these buildings when Just Stop Oil started spraying it with a fire extinguisher with their orange paint. This security guard had been told not to lay hands on these protesters because the minute they do that, kind of the actions of the protester becomes the responsibility of the security guard. So if paint gets sprayed upon an innocent member of the public, they might have some regress in law against the security guard. You know, it's kind of like, crikey, actually you could be laying hands on to prevent further crime. Either so, our police should be doing this fearlessly, but they're being caught on the hop. There clearly isn't the intelligence, advanced intelligence, to tell them where and when these protests are going to take place. So it is even more important that when they do come across them, they act robustly, swiftly and promptly. All the things they promised us they were going to do, and manifestly we're not seeing.
Well, let's hope that these conversations that we've been having this morning are replicated inside Number 10 this afternoon as this meeting takes place. We'll be looking closely at the readout for this meeting to see if anything at all has been agreed or advanced. But for now, Peter Bleksley, thank you so much for joining us here on the briefing this morning. Well, now the Prime Minister has created a special strikes unit to tackle the wave of walkouts that could disrupt services every day until Christmas. It comes as more than 10,000 ambulance workers become the latest group to vote for industrial action. Well, earlier this morning, the shadow leader of the House of Commons, Stagnam Debonair, told GB News that if the Labour Party were in charge, there wouldn't be any strikes at all.
Do you know what? In 13 years of a Labour government between 1997 and 2010, there were no strikes in the NHS. Why? Why were there no strikes? We'd have been negotiating with them for the last few months. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be in this position. We'd have been negotiating and working with them. We wouldn't have caused the economic crises that the Tory government caused when they brought forward that disastrous, uncosted, unfunded mini-budget back under the Liz Truss premiership, which everyone seems to want to forget about. That it's important to be clear why we're here. Why are we here? Because of Tory economic mismanagement. A Labour government would have made different choices. We would never have had that disastrous mini-budget, which caused housing costs to spiral. That's why we're in this situation right now. And I'm placing responsibility where it belongs, which is on successive Tory chancellors and prime ministers who've left us in this mess.
Stagnam Debonair speaking there. Well, let's explore this strikes question in greater detail. Dr. Richard Johnson is a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University of London and joins me now. And there's a lot of comparison that's made, particularly this winter, with the winter of 1979, what became to be known as the winter of discontent. And we all know the stories, the dead left unburied, rubbish piled high in the streets, the very fabric of the country grinding to a halt. Is this winter going to be comparable?
I don't think it can be, in the sense that the density of union membership today is much lower than it was in the 1970s. So when the winter of discontent took place, about 85% of the British workforce was covered by some collectively bargained contract. That's more like 1 in 4 now, and in the private sector, it's much lower, lower than 10%. There are obviously some sectors of the economy that are more unionized than others, and some are quite well unionized, and that's where there will be some of these pressure points, and these are particularly in kind of the public facing sectors, the public services, and so that's probably why politically this might still hit the government even if union density is much lower than it was 45 years ago.
It's interesting looking at the politics around all of this and in terms of who might well be blamed for these sort of strikes. Looking at various opinion polls as they have been so far, it looks like the government may well be getting more blame than those who are actually choosing to down tools and leave work. Looking back over the history of strikes, does that sometimes shift the longer that strikes go on?
It can do. I think part of the issue is if you have a government that's been in power for a long time, most things accumulate as part of blame for the government. It's sometimes called in political science the cost of governing effect. In the 70s, the situation was that the Labour government had what was called a social contract agreement with the union leadership, and so there was meant to be restraint on demands from the unions, and that had been negotiated between the union leaders and the Labour government. And basically what happened was the grassroots union membership rebelled against the union leaders and called for kind of local strike action against the leaders. It's quite a different situation at the moment because we don't have that kind of the beer and sandwiches approach at number 10 that was the case in the Wilson and Callaghan years. And also I think the leadership of the unions today tends to be a little bit more militant, shall we say, probably closer to where the members are, or the more activist members than the leaders of the 70s, I think, where they were a little bit more perhaps conservative in their approach.
That's really fascinating because when we think back to the 70s and indeed 80s, we think to sort of the Arthur Scargills of this world. But is what you're saying, they were more of an exception than the rule when it came to union leadership?
That's right. So most of the major union leaders were, they wanted to have a good relationship with the Labour government. And, Jim Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister, had come out of the trade union movement himself, had good relations with the trade union leaders. He was the one who spiked Barbara Castle's trade union reforms in the 1960s, her In Place of Strife document. He was meeting regularly with the trade union leaders in 1978. And they were the ones who were actually advising him to go to the country in the autumn of 78 before the winter. And the reason they said that was because they were not confident that they could retain this wage restraint, that they could feel that the membership of the unions was tiring of the social contract. And they were proven correct, that eventually they couldn't keep their members on side anymore. And that's when all these kind of strikes broke out in different parts of the country, including some action that wasn't even official action, like the infamous Liverpool grave diggers and so on.
It's interesting, though, to look at where the Labour Party is positioning itself today. Not saying, for example, that it would acquiesce to the 19% pay rise demands of the nurses, for example, and also telling the TUC conference this year that they were sort of working with business as well, that they aren't just sort of the representation of the Labour movement in this country. What does this say about where the Labour Party stands with regard vis-à-vis the Conservative Party when it comes to all of these unions and their strikes?
It shows what a long shadow the winter of discontent has on the political culture of this country. And, the 80s, in many ways, Labour's change on economic policy, the rise of New Labour and so on was very much constantly making reference back to we mustn't have another winter of discontent. And I suppose the Starmer leadership is concerned that they wouldn't want to be associated with that either. I personally think, though, that although perhaps among the political class, the winter of discontent is still something people think about. I think probably most people in the country now, it's so long ago that they don't really have that as a visceral reference point anymore. And I think what people are feeling in the country is the cost of living squeeze, and the discontent, I think, now is with 12 years of Conservative government, which feels like it's not got to grips with where the changing economy is today and what people need in terms of housing, and all of those kind of other pressures with paying their bills and so on. So, I think that this is possibly another example of where the Starmer leadership is more cautious than it needs to be, and is operating in this similar reference point to the politics of Labour 25 years ago under New Labour. I'm not sure that exactly meets the demands and requirements of the country today.
It's fascinating that this long shadow, 43 years ago, the winter of discontent was, but we're still talking about it today. I wonder, though, in the broader spectrum of things, the Labour Party is walking a bit of a tightrope. And this week it's lent into a story that Tony Blair and the like under New Labour really shied away from, and that's the thorny issue of private education. Has the Labour Party struck a chord here on their idea to tax the school fees of those at independent schools? Or have they fallen into a bit of a trap that Tony Blair always managed to avoid?
I guess Blair's achievement was seen to be that he was not anti-aspiration, and so this always goes into that discussion about is Labour anti-aspiration or not. I mean, I actually think there's a whole discussion that the Labour Party should be having about VAT as a tax. This is a tax regime that we had to adopt when we joined the common market, and actually now being out of the EU. Traditionally Labour was against VAT, supported various luxury taxes, but not as wide-ranging as the VAT regime that we had to adopt when we were in the EU. I don't really hear Labour talking about this in any joined-up way, and this is, again, I think, another example of where Labour hasn't really thought about the benefits of Brexit from a Labour perspective, because so many people in the Labour Party had this kind of, I think, irrational hatred of Brexit that they couldn't see some of the reasons why Labour opposed going in the first place. And one of the reasons why so many people in the Labour Party opposed going in the 70s was VAT. I mean, that's one of the reasons Barbara Castle used to do all these price comparisons, because there were more items that had VAT in the common market than here. So there's a wider story here to be had, I think.
A really, really interesting angle that we haven't heard much about at all before. But Professor Richard Johnson, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing and talking through those Labour stories. Really, really interesting stuff. But finally today, another battle on the hands of the Prime Minister. I'm joined in the studio by our political reporter Olivia Utley. We're talking about this division over wind farms, because since Monday there's been all this sort of argument about it. But today there seems to be new evidence that it seems that this ban on onshore wind farms could be costing households almost £1 billion this winter.
Yeah, it's a fascinating statistic, which is in Bloomberg this morning, suggesting, as you say, it could be costing households £1 billion this winter. This is talking about the onshore wind farm, which has been in place since 2016, and it is imagining, were this ban not in place, households would be this much better off.
Right.
Of course, lifting the ban now wouldn't give us £800 million worth of energy in the next weeks or anything, but it's a big story which will put more pressure on the Prime Minister to reverse this ban on onshore wind farms, and he is already under a lot of pressure to do that. It sounds as though the government is pretty much on the cusp of reversing it. You've got 34 a couple of days ago, the number of Tory MPs who were planning to rebel against the ban on onshore wind farms to support the Simon Clarke's amendment to the Levelling Up Bill, which would lift the ban.
Which has the support of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, Alok Sharma, many big beasts in the Conservative Party.
Many big beasts, but then there are also big beasts in the cabinet who are very pro the ban on onshore wind farms. They represent constituencies where these wind farms are being built. Their constituents often don't like it very much. You've got Steve Barclay, Chris Heaton-Harris, two big Rishi Sunak supporters, and big beasts in the cabinet who are opposing it. So it's quite difficult to see how Rishi Sunak is going to keep everyone happy. And it looked a couple of days ago as though the government really was just about to give in to this amendment from Simon Clarke and allow onshore wind farms to be built. But we're 2 days on from that and still nothing's quite happened. So it seems as though a consensus hasn't yet been exactly reached.
I wonder if they're going to go back to the sort of community consent mechanism that Jacob Rees-Mogg used to talk about when it came to fracking, when it came to shale gas onshore. It seems like there are many, many comparisons here, because ultimately Liz Truss used to talk about the anti-growth coalition, the people that stop construction, stop things being built, stop money being generated. It seems to me that when it comes to this issue, the comparison between fracking and onshore shale and onshore wind are two peas in a pod. Those who oppose the ban could, or those who are in favour of the ban, could very easily be described as being part of an anti-growth coalition.
Yes, and the way that the ban works at the moment is just if just one person in a community is against a new onshore wind farm, then that farm won't be built. So the way Simon Clarke, the MP who's pushing forward this amendment, which would allow the building of new onshore wind farms, is phrasing it, the way he's trying to make it work for MPs who live in constituencies where there are lots of wind farms, is to say that if we don't do this now, our way, if we don't put forward this amendment and turn it into a bill where community consent is needed to build a wind farm, then Labour's just going to do it and they're going to remove the whole community consent thing altogether. But even if this amendment does get through, you can imagine that there will be whole communities which don't consent to onshore wind farms. So we could see this whole rebellion being about nothing that much at all, because we still don't see that many onshore wind farms.
Really interesting one. Well, one to follow, of course, that levelling up bill with so many amendments now attached to it. It's getting quite unwielding. We'll follow that very carefully indeed. But that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's Bev Turner today. But first, here's the weather.
Hello, a very good morning to you. I'm Aidan McGibbon from the Met Office. It's a cold start out there for many of us. A frost in places, foggy for some as well, damp for others. So a mixture across the UK at the moment. But we've all got something in common, and that is a large area of high pressure extending from the east. That's mostly keeping these weather fronts at bay, but one such feature has snuck in from the west to affect Scotland, Northern Ireland and northwest England during the last 24 hours. Now, for Scotland and the far north of England, it is a damp and dull start to the day, the rain continuing through much of the day here. Northern Ireland, brighter skies arrive, but for much of England and Wales, dense fog patches first thing. Could be tricky on the roads, for example. The fog does slowly lift and brighter skies do emerge in the south and across Wales, where we see that happening 7 to 11 Celsius, but where we do see some stubborn fog persisting into the afternoon, 2 to 5 Celsius. It is actually a little milder for Western Scotland and Northern Ireland, however, because we've got a bit more of a southerly breeze here. That breeze will push the rain into eastern Scotland, the northeast of England by the end of the night tonight. But elsewhere across the UK, a lot of cloud remains. Low cloud through central parts, some dense fog patches by dawn, and again a touch of frost in places. Now, the brightest skies first thing tomorrow will be across parts of Wales and the southwest. Northern Ireland as well, faring well for sunshine, and eventually western Scotland. The rain in the far northeast eventually peters away, so most places will see a dry Friday, and the fog in the south will also lift. I think more likely to lift compared with recent days because the breeze from the east is picking up. Now, that breeze will become an increasingly dominant feature of the forecast over the next few days. It will tend to prevent a fog and frost forming at night, but it will also bring colder air this weekend. So brighter skies on Saturday and Sunday, but with a downturn in temperatures, some rain and hill snow showers.
Monday to Thursday night.